Hello and welcome back to another edition of Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang with our panel of foreign journalists. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for joining me. Now, the sudden influx of more than 500 Yemeni refugees to Jeju-do Island in recent months has sparked a fierce debate over whether or not South Korea should accept these asylum seekers and grant them refugee status. Let's take a look. The issue of refugees is shaking up the Korean society. A fierce debate has emerged following revelations that some 500 refugees from Yemen had arrived on Jeju-do Island. These asylum seekers had entered the country from January to May of this year through Jeju-do Island's visa-waiver policy.
현재 인도적인 사유가 좀 있는 사람들 또는 취업을 하지 못한 사람들 또 출도가 좀 긴급하다고 판단되는 사람들을 위주로 해서 우선적으로 심사를 진행할 계획입니다.
As of May 2018, the total number of refugee applicants to South Korea has exceeded 40,000 individuals. Roughly 800, or 4.1% of them, have been granted refugee status, while 1,500 more have been allowed temporary asylum on humanitarian grounds. Until now, South Korea had been far removed from the ongoing global debate surrounding refugees, but it now finds itself in the midst of heated debate following an unprecedented influx of refugees within its borders. According to a survey released on July 5th, 5 out of 10 South Koreans were opposed to the idea of accepting the refugees on Jeju-do Island.
그 사람들이 한국 사회에 적응하지 못하고 떠돌이가 되었을 때 발생할 수 있는 어떤 그런 테러의 위험도 있을 것이고 또한 그 사람들을 한국에서의 어떤 적응을 위한 재사회화의 교육이 필요한데 그런 비용도 만만치 않게 부담이 있을 거라 생각합니다.
However, pro-refugee advocates continue to make their voices heard, saying that the refugees must be accepted on humanitarian grounds.
난민이 차별받고 보호받지 못하는 나라에서 그 나라 국민들의 인권을 보호받을 수 있을까 하는 생각이 들어요.
Meanwhile, on June 29th, the South Korean government announced a set of response measures which included thorough background checks on refugee applicants, as well as amendments to the existing refugee law.
보호 필요성과 관계없이 경제적 목적 또는 국내 체류 방편으로 난민 제도를 악용하는 일이 없도록 난민법 개정을 추진하겠습니다. 난민 심사관을 증언하고 난민 신청하는 나라의 정황 정보를 수집하고 분석하는 전담팀을 신설하는 등 난민 심사 전문성 강화를 위한 인프라를 확보해 나가겠습니다.
The Yemeni refugee issue on Jeju-do Island has come as a shock to the South Korean society, which now needs to act prudently in order to reach a desirable solution. Now, South Korea is certainly not alone in terms of having to deal with divided public opinions on the issue of refugees. Do you think Korea is being more reserved than other countries compared to when, for example, France or Germany first started accepting refugees?
Much more so, yeah, definitely. I mean, actually this refugee issue started already a couple of years back when people from Syria tried to come to Korea and they got stuck at Incheon airport. They couldn't even enter the country. They made it on Korean soil, but were not allowed to enter through immigration. So they had 40, 50 people jammed into small rooms for weeks and weeks. This is not an entirely new problem, but it's the first time that we see such a large number, which is actually a tiny number compared to 2 million foreigners already living in Korea. It's really nothing. But Korea is really reacting relatively hostile towards these refugees at this point, which is really very, very sad, I believe.
South Korea should remember, like a lot of people here in the South were refugees during the war. And this is something that when I interview this Yemeni refugee, his name is Adnan, he told me exactly the same thing, that when he was in Jeju, he feels that older generation feel more understanding towards him because they knew what is a war, they know what it is to leave everything behind you and to start anew in a new country. And I found that this link between what happened here 70 years ago and what's happening now quite interesting.
Very interesting.
It's a very interesting issue. I think you're touching there because recently I have been discussing with several people about this topic and also Korean people, and I was really shocked to see how many misunderstandings there are and how people reject it. And I always said, what would you think if, just take the scenario, okay, recently the relationship with North Korea has become more friendly and now people talk about even reunification. But until last year, it was just brimstone and fire talk going on. So there was the actual danger of war. What do you think would happen if war comes? You think lots of people, tens of thousands of South Koreans, would try to flee the war and would go to other countries. And then if all the countries said, don't come here, you know, we don't want you here, how would you feel about that, you know? In a country where this risk has always been there, that war could erupt at almost any time, and where lots of the people living here now in peace could be refugees the next day in some other country, especially in a country like this, I was hoping for a little bit more understanding of this kind of situation.
When I see the reaction now, this huge xenophobic wave against these fake refugees, as they are called, I really think it's a matter of fear of the unknown, fear of strangers, that could really be solved if people actually talk to them, like I did. If you talk to this Yemeni refugee, you will realize that they don't want to spread Islam, as we could have read in some social media. They don't try to steal jobs or to rape women, as some crazy far-right people are saying.
Okay. Horiyama, what do you think?
Fake refugee is possible because there are international group to be paid with assistance. But the problem is we shouldn't see all refugees as criminal, and we need to get rid of this bias. There are also prejudice in Japan, but I'd like to emphasize, even though people who fail to get refugee status, we can't say they are fake refugees, because there are a lot of harder tasks to prove with document they are refugee with political or religious or security risk.
Right.
But it's difficult to prove with document.
I know that these days there is some issue with some lawyers who've been accused of taking Chinese nationals and help them to pretend they're refugees and they're escaping some persecution in their country, just to help them to settle in Korea, like there is now a case. But in case for the Yemeni, last week from UNICEF, in Yemen now you have 22 million people in need, 8 million on the brink of famine, and in Yemen, 1 child dies every 10 minutes. So when I read that these Yemeni refugees in Jeju are fake, that actually makes me very sad, because people should just look at what's happening. These 500 Yemeni who left their countries, they didn't leave because they wanted to visit the teddy bear museum in Jeju. They're really fleeing like horror of the war, and they're trying to escape death.
I totally agree. It doesn't only make me sad, it actually makes me really angry. And all those people who are saying these things and posting those things, I really recommend to them, visit Yemen. Just 1 week. And then you come back and tell me these are fake refugees. Just go there, have the guts, and really face the music. Look at the actual situation these people are in. And they say, oh, these are all young men and so on. You have to look at the situation why the young men are coming, for example. Because they just have the option. Either you go to fight for a war which you don't believe in. It's not about protecting their country from entering forces. We have to remember, this is a civil war.
Yeah.
So it's parties fighting each other where most of the population has absolutely no interest in this fight. So, and this is a fight they haven't started, and they surely don't want to die for a war they don't believe in. But the only options they have is to fight for a war, kill other people, or die themselves in a war they don't believe in, or if they refuse, they go to prison or being executed. Maybe even if there was some trafficker involved in the process of bringing them here, that has nothing to do with their status being real or fake refugees in the first place. A lot of people who flee for good reasons still need help in doing that. So just saying, because I don't say there was an agency involved. I think in this case, actually, there was not. But even if it turns out to be that there was an agency involved in helping them, it doesn't have anything to do with them being fake or not fake. And I think that's also a very, very important point. And another thing I wanted to touch on is, like, Korean people think, why do these people come here and we are totally detached from these people? We have nothing to do with these people. If you talk about those issues, really you should look a little bit deeper and look at the war and why the war is going on and who's helping this war. For example, Saudi Arabia is big time involved in this war and keeping this war going. And you know who's paying a lot of money to Saudi Arabia? That's South Korea. South Korea is the 5th largest money giver to Saudi Arabia when it comes to importing energy from Saudi Arabia. So Korea is already related to this war in some way or another, if they want or don't want it. So people coming here, and then Korean people say, oh, we don't have anything to do with these people and we don't want these people. Really, people should at least take the time and look at the issue a little bit more deep to understand maybe we have something to do with these people.
And perhaps take the responsibility for taking part.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's come back to the Korean politics. How much of this Yemeni refugee issue will have an impact on Moon Jae-in government's approval rating, do you think?
Maybe I will play devil's advocate, but I think Moon Jae-in shouldn't care that much. He just won the last election. He has a huge support so far. He has his mandate. I mean, he should do what he thinks to be fit and not care about the small variation of a popularity rate that really don't mean much.
Right.
So he has a vision and he should follow it.
He has been a human rights lawyer, right? So he should care about human rights more than the average person. And as Fred just said, not only is his overall approval rating still very good, but he can't even be re-elected. So that's kind of a freedom given to a Korean president. At least you can do what you think is right.
And I guess we should not forget that it's not all Koreans that are opposed to the refugees. There is very much a pro-refugee faction going on. So perhaps his popularity rating won't be as affected as some worry about.
Let's hope so.
Yes. Now, before South Korea, many other countries, such as European countries, have long dealt with the issue of pro-refugee and against refugees. So how have these European countries dealt with the refugee issue so far? Let's take a look. At the EU summit held in Brussels on June 29th, the leaders from 28 EU member states adopted a joint statement outlining key agreements regarding their refugee policies.
Insgesamt glaube ich, nach intensiver Diskussion bei dem Thema, das vielleicht das herausforderndste Thema für die Europäische Union ist, ist es eine gute Botschaft, dass wir einen gemeinsamen Text fahren.
Et nous devons réussir à faire face à ce défi en étant fidèles à nos valeurs, en protégeant nos peuples et la cohésion nationale.
The document included pledges to build more migrant centers, while at the same time tightening border security to restrict the movement of asylum seekers. The refugee question has become a hot potato issue in Europe, following a huge flow of migrants from countries like Syria, Sudan, and Afghanistan in the years following 2010. At the initial onset of the crisis, the majority of the public was in support of accepting these refugees on humanitarian grounds. However, anti-refugee sentiments have been steadily gaining support in recent years. In Italy, which has become a gateway to Europe for refugees making their way across the Mediterranean, public support for Lega, a far-right political party, has seen a significant rise. Lega claims that Italy has been invaded by refugees and has pledged to evict all 500,000 illegal asylum seekers in Italy and return them to their countries of origin. Meanwhile, over in Germany, the right-wing anti-refugee and anti-Muslim AfD party entered parliament as the country's third-largest political party following last year's federal elections. In France as well, where anti-refugee sentiments have picked up traction, far-right candidate Marine Le Pen of the National Rally Party was the top vote-getter in the first round of last year's French presidential elections. With the ongoing refugee crisis threatening to reshape Europe's political landscape, the refugee issue is no longer an isolated problem being faced by a select few countries, but rather a global issue that demands multilateral cooperation. So in your respective countries, what were some of the most noteworthy refugee-related events that have taken place so far?
Recently, there was an issue with a boat named Aquarius, which is an NGO that is managing this boat, and they go in Mediterranean Sea and they try to help migrants who usually are in a very, very poor boat, and they're like basically when they take them on their boat to try to bring them back safely, otherwise they will die at sea. Every year we have thousands of people who die in the Mediterranean Sea. And the problem was that Italy has a new government, and the new government refused to accept this boat full of, there were 650 refugees, migrants on that boat. So they didn't know where to go. Finally, Spain accepted them.
That's what we see in Europe right now, all over the place, that lots of countries, if there are elections, they're almost all moving towards the right. We have seen this in Austria, we have seen this in Slovenia, in Poland, in Hungary, even in Denmark, in Italy recently, which is very dramatic, because Italy is so much affected by the influx of migrants. So it's becoming a very, very big problem also for Germany, for example, who tries to find a European solution for this whole issue. And it could be very well the issue that shows if the EU as a union is able to handle actual problems, or if it will fall apart and everybody just thinks of themselves.
Right. So speaking of the EU, the leaders of EU countries, they recently reached a landmark agreement where they pledged to build more migrant centers while at the same time bolstering security at the borders. How significant is this?
It's very positive that finally the European leaders are able to agree on something and pledge to do something. And you're right in mentioning Italy. Italy was basically receiving most of the migrants, and they were really, I mean, didn't receive enough help from other European countries. Of course, this agreement was criticized. People are not happy. Some people think we should have done further. But once again, it's better than nothing, and I think it's a positive first step.
Okay, Horiyama, for the host nations accepting the asylum seekers, what sort of tangible benefits do you think they can enjoy?
I think refugee issue is a human issue, but Japanese government tried to select Asian refugee who can work hard as workers. So NGO organization criticize these attitudes. It's too egoistic or nationalistic. Maybe Korea has also a similar dilemma.
So Germany has, for a long time, it has sustained one of the most open border policies regarding asylum seekers in the whole world. How do you think it's been able to sustain that?
The German people were initially and are still in a vast majority, I think, relatively welcoming these people and realizing that people who are willing to leave everything behind, leave sometimes their families behind, leave their houses and their homeland behind, and travel thousands of kilometers not knowing if they will even make the journey, that somebody so desperate first needs help. And it's not our job to ask first if he, for what reason he comes here. I think that's not the most important issue. And I think German people realize that. And German people also, after the war, we had lots of migration. The size of Germany shrinked quite significantly after World War II. So lots of German people living in countries that are now other countries, which was part of Germany. So we have history of migration. People knew how it was to run away, leave everything behind. And I think even though World War II is now almost 70 years behind us, or more than that already, but it's still, this memory is still there. And the second thing is that Angela Merkel, our chancellor, was very bold in her decision to just said, okay, we open the borders and come here. And first come, and then we see how we handle this. And I think this was a very courageous approach, what she did. And though obviously it also created certain problems, not only for her, but also for the German people in general. Overall, I think it was the right decision to do. It was the moral and ethic right decision to do.
Okay, now let's move on to France. In recent years, France has been the victim of numerous terrorism attacks carried out by extremist Islamic groups. Have those events shaped the public's opinion regarding refugees coming from Islamic countries?
It definitely helped the far-right politicians, especially the Front National, who has a very anti-Islam, anti-foreigner base. But I mean, I have to say that all these attacks we suffer on our soil were not made by refugees. They were made by usually French people born in France from French parents. So all this attack we suffer is more a symptom of the failure of our like Republican social assimilation model, rather than it's not a migration issue at all. And it's not because, I mean, obviously being a Muslim doesn't mean you're being a terrorist, and I think people know that. So it didn't really change in terms of like a migrant policy. I don't think it had such a big impact.
Okay, and Horiyama, what's the situation in Japan regarding asylum seekers and refugees?
I have experience to cover refugee in Japan. So
Okay.
there are apartment complex living Indo-Chinese refugees. Japan accepted Indo-Chinese more than 10,000. It's largest of any refugee group in Japan. So it started at the end of 1970s. I wanted to show through my report how settled refugee contribute to Japanese community. So now second and third generation was working in Japan, and they tried to work as volunteer to support new refugees. So it's a good example in Japan. So a few years ago, Syrian refugee apply for refugee status in Japan. There are a lot of negative opinion in Japan, but I trying to say we remind of good experience of Indo-Chinese models.
Right. Okay, very interesting. Now, so far we've talked about what the host countries can do for the refugees, but let's wrap up with a question. What can the refugees do for themselves? What are some actions or efforts on the refugees' part that will help sort of alleviate the reservedness or the fear that host nations might have?
Well, I think most important is that they behave well. That is really the utmost important thing. The moment we have crimes committed by these people, I think the likelihood, and the numbers have shown over the last years in Germany, that the likelihood of that happening is relatively low.
The crimes committed by the refugees are more highly publicized.
Exactly, that's always, it's a huge issue, you know, that if one refugee does something, then it's all over the press, and the right-wing parties always really use these kind of things. So I think the number one rule is for the refugees really try to behave as well as possible, obey the law, and also just show with kindness to people. Even if people come to you and are hostile in a certain way, I think the best way to answer that is with kindness.
Okay, and Fred?
Learning the language would be very important. If you move to a country, that's really one of the first things you have to do. And this is actually, I think, in terms of this Yemeni refugee I talked to, told me that he wanted to learn the language, and there is some local people in Jeju who are trying to you are ready to teach them for free, to volunteer. And I think that's great. That's really the first step.
Right. Okay, and Horiyama?
Of course, refugees need to make effort to communicate with local people, but the host country should provide educational system for them to learn language or culture, because Japan or Korea is not familiar language for them. So I think they are responsible for host country to provide opportunity to education.
Okay. All right. Do you have any final comments?
I think it's a very interesting topic. It's a very important topic for Korea at this point in time. And even though the number of refugees is still so small, still it already has become a big issue. But I really hope, and I sincerely hope, that more refugees will come here, and that Korean society is open for them. It will actually benefit the Korean people more than, maybe in some sense, even benefit the society more than we can give to these refugees. I truly believe that.
Okay, and Horiyama, do you have any final comments to add?
Actually, I respect Korean effort because it's better than Japanese situation. So I'd like to learn Korean experience as Japanese. We have same challenge to overcome prejudice or discrimination.
Okay, okay.
Well, I think the current refugee crisis is a very good warning sign for Korea. I'm a foreigner. I'm not in a position to say anything to South Korea whether they should accept more or less refugees, but what I'm saying is that there is a high probability that much more will come in the future. So really, Korea and Korean society should be ready for that.
Right, there's more to come.
Yes.
All right, in 2013, South Korea became one of the first countries in Asia to adopt refugee laws into its regulation. But up until now, the country has been quite far removed from where the actual debate was taking place. And hopefully the current situation in Jeju Island regarding the Yemeni refugees will provide a valuable opportunity for the country to re-examine where it is, where it stands in terms of its refugee policies, immigration laws, and multiculturalism. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.